Welcome back to Notre Dame Day 2024. I'm Jenna Liberto. Sport is one of the most enduringly popular and significant cultural activities in the world, and data has long played a central role in American professional sports. For our next guest, this intersection of professional sport and data collection gave her the idea for a fascinating new course that she'll be sharing with us today. She is an assistant teaching professor of American Studies and concurrent faculty member in the Gender Studies program and the Department of Computer Science and Engineering. Katie Walden, welcome to Notre Dame Day.
Welcome. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. Just saying those two things together, this intersection, right, is so fascinating. So let's start by, I want to ask what specifically inspired you to create this course, and it's called Sport and Big Data.
Sport and Big Data. Well, my research in American Studies looks at sport and American culture, and for about a decade I've been thinking about baseball and baseball in communities and labor. And so some of the methods I use in my research involve working with a lot of data. And then as a baseball fan, fantasy leagues, fantasy teams, sports gaming, we're just drowning or swimming in data. And so it was something that my research was starting to ask questions about: how do we make sense of this? What does it mean? And one of the beautiful things we get to do at a place like Notre Dame is teach things that connect to our research and connect students to brand new, cutting edge, emerging conversations in our research fields. So that's how the course kind of took shape for me. I had a set of questions that I was really interested in thinking through, and students are really interested in thinking through them with me.
Take me through that a little bit deeper. What have you uncovered in your personal research that prepared you or laid the foundation for this course?
Well, I think there's two big threads that I learned as I was starting to build out the course to teach it for the first time. The first one was just no surprise. Data is everywhere in sport. If we go back to the 1800s, if we look at different times in sport history, different types of sport, it's everywhere. And there's both the amount of data that gets harvested and collected when we think about big data and analytics, and I know the speaker before me was talking about AI, but there's also James Naismith writing down in his notebook in Springfield, Massachusetts, in the early stages of basketball. We've seen this over the last few years, scoring controversies in sports like figure skating and gymnastics. So it's both the big data side of it, but it's also maybe data in all kinds of different ways, and the choices that get made about what we count and how we count and even who we count and the stakes of that just expanded my thinking. So it was both so many things can be sport and big data. The problem is not what do we do in that class, it's what don't we do. But then I think the other thread of that was really interesting, you mentioned in my intro, I also am connected over to computer science and engineering. There's a field that's come up in the last few years called critical data studies. So being able to see emerging conversations that don't necessarily focus on sport, but think about data and society and how that shapes us to think about sport in new ways is, again, where I get to think through cutting edge ideas in my research with a really incredibly smart group of students over a semester. That's a wonderful thing.
I'm curious, you mentioned these broad topics or these big kind of topics for your course. What are your students' reactions?
Yeah, so my core field and the department where the course is housed is American Studies. So our field, we ask these big questions about race, gender, class, power, identity, intersectionality. So those are some of the themes that animate it, but we look at it in so many different contexts. James Naismith, back in the early days, we watch Moneyball for a class. How cool is that?
That makes sense.
And then one of the things I love about the course is we get to connect it to real world events. So when I teach the course and the Olympics are happening, we get to look at Winter Olympic events in sports. How many other places do you get to just email students a half an hour before class and saying, we're going to watch the fencing national championships.
That's
Everybody great. Meet at the Joyce Center. So I think it's both being able to connect it in real time, and then a lot of my courses are really focused on giving students the opportunity to take ownership of their learning. And so students take that class because they're excited to think about sport and big data. They might play a sport, they might be a student manager, they might have been running their own fantasy league since they were 6 years old, and that becomes their final project in the course. It was great. But they have things that they're interested in. So it's both my job as a teacher is to provide a framework. They come in with all their interests and experiences. We learn together and we learn from and with each other. And then students, again, I think are excited to just talk to people who are interested in asking smart questions. Someone who maybe has played the sport, talking to someone who's interested in broadcasting the sport. Someone who maybe doesn't play the sport, but is really interested in how they build their fantasy league and evaluate talent. Students who who are in Notre Dame athletics playing for some of our Irish teams, then helping the rest of us better understand how data and technology shows up and what that means. So all kinds of reactions, most of them positive.
I'm curious about another potential intersection, which would be Division I athletics and the culture around that and your course. Does that come up?
It does. And so I mentioned the fencing example of just, I realized looking at the calendar that the fencing national championships were happening during our class meeting, and so we were able to go watch that. But when we have a unit in the course that looks about basketball and spatial statistics, and we do that during March Madness. So again, I think there's very few other institutions in the country where you would be able to think about data and sport and actually go in your literal backyard and see sport at this level, but then also think about, what does this mean for the common good? How do we connect all of this to human dignity and flourishing? What questions do we need to ask to understand the impact that these technologies and practices and systems are having on people? The people who play the sports, our environment and the environmental costs, but it's also all of us as fans. So all of those threads together is a really great mix.
Well, it sounds fascinating. I'd like to draft you on my Notre Dame Day fantasy team.
Okay.
All right, Katie.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate
Go Irish.
You. Go Irish.